Welcome back, squad. 5 guys I like getting on. Nope, this week. Let's go. Trey Tucker going against the Dallas Cowboys defense. We're back on the Cowboys. They're worst in fantasy points per game given up to the wide receiver position, and they're second worst in total points overall given up to the position, and they've already had their bye. Yikes. For Tucker specifically, they are fourth worst to the wide receiver out wide, so that is mostly Tucker's primarily position. He plays there probably 80% of the time, and I think to some degree this has to be a bit of a barn burner. Dallas is fourth in total points scored overall as a team, so Dak will sling it and gun it and run it. He won't do that, but he'll do the other ones. So the Raiders will have to keep up, surely, right? So there's always that fear, but the numbers look good for Trey Tucker. If you're going to start him, I feel like this is the week for him to perform. If it's not this week, I don't know when it's going to be, and you don't know either, so that's cool. Hesitantly, it's a good matchup. Trey Tucker. Question mark? Up next, it's a tale as old as time. Players versus the Bengals. Specifically this week, Jaylen Warren. The Bengals defense is last in fantasy points a game and last in red zone fantasy points a game to running backs. They're dead last in touches and attempts. I think there could be a lot of points scored, a lot of throwing, which means targets to the running back, but also I imagine he could get into the end zone in this game. Lots of points. Don't overthink it. Jaylen Warren versus the Bengals. This one's a little risque for sure, but Zach Ertz against the Dolphins has a good matchup. The Dolphins are bottom 5 in fantasy points a game and red zone fantasy points a game, given up 2 tight ends. They're bottom 10 in yards and catches allowed. And Ertz is just slowly chugging along. He has 4 or more targets in the last 5 weeks. And last week with Mariota under center, he tied for the team lead in targets and catches. Now that wasn't a high number, but it's interesting to note, I think Ertz is in a decent enough position. He could get into the end zone against Miami. They're kind of not a bad defense now, except against tight ends, which is interesting. I'm not super sure what to make of that, but either way, Ertz is in a good position this week, and I hesitantly am optimistic about him versus the Dolphins. This is in the camp of Tucker that I'm a little hesitant about this, but I am somewhat confident enough to say it out loud. Justin Herbert going against the Jaguars. Now the hesitation is because they lost Joe Alt, and against the Steelers defense, who was really bad, he put up around 15 fantasy points, which is not amazing. Could he bounce back? Yeah, of course. And here's why he could do it this week. Over the last 4 weeks, the Jags are last in red zone fantasy points per game given up to quarterbacks and last in total fantasy points per game given up to quarterbacks. So the last 4, they've been really bad. They've also been bottom 5 in attempts and completions for quarterbacks. And overall, they're bottom 5 in red zone fantasy points a game and total fantasy points a game. So they haven't had a great season anyways. They're bottom 5 in attempts and yards, and they're second worst in touchdowns allowed to quarterbacks. So it's a good matchup for Herbert, for sure. Plus, you have to remember the QB1 last week was Mr. Mills, who had like 27 points. Not saying Herbert will get 27, which is crazy that that's the world we live in, but it's a good matchup for him. He's going to have very little time to throw. That is just the new normal now, which does scare me, but the Jags offense can score enough. So I think the Chargers will be okay, and I think Herbert will be relatively fine. Pretty decent floor in this matchup. Feel fairly good about him. And the last one, Uncle Rico is back against the Falcons. Over the last 4 weeks, the Falcons have been pretty bad. They're worst in fantasy points per game given up to running backs, worst in red zone fantasy points a game, worst in total fantasy points given up to the position, and worst in touches and attempts. That's almost all of them. But don't worry, they're only second worst in yards and targets allowed, so that's nice. And on the year overall, they're bottom 5 in almost all of those categories, and Uncle Rico cannot be stopped. Good matchup. You probably weren't going to bench him, but if you were going to, because it's the scary Falcons, they're not scary, it's just a bird. And a bonus one that isn't really a bonus one, I was just really intrigued by this stat. No kicker has missed a field goal against the Dallas Cowboys. Maybe that's because half their games are indoors. I don't know, but no kicker has missed against them. They're bottom 10 in fantasy points per game given up to kickers. Now that I say it out loud, someone's obviously going to miss this week, but it's just interesting, little fun tidbit. Before tonight's game, it was the Eagles who were last in kicker points, but now I think it's the Jets. So do with that what you will. It's the kicker position. It's a crapshoot. Anyway, good luck in week 11. Let me know what y'all think, who you're starting, who you're sitting, who you're playing, who you're not playing. Curious to see your guys' thoughts and opinions. Keenan Allen's never going to die. Peace out. Although he is getting older.